Hi, I'm Femi OK. It has been 10 years since a people's uprising in Syria turned into a full-blown war. Some of these images you see back here are shocking, but perhaps what is even more shocking is that they may not be moving us as much as they did 10 years ago. And that is an issue about Syria. Do people really care around the world? Today we bring together on the stream Syrian voices, Syrians, to talk about the past 10 years and what they hope for the future. We start with Katie.
I think people around the world engaged with the Syrian conflict in different ways, and now they are disengaging for different reasons. First, some people engaged because of Islamophobic attitudes, and after the fall of ISIS or the Islamic State, they are now disengaging. Second, some people engaged because of true solidarity and empathy, but after 10 years of conflict, they reach what we call in media studies compassion fatigue. And third, because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people around the world are focusing on the suffering of their own communities and not distant communities like in Syria.
We're joined on today's episode by Mariam, Dr. Zaher, and also Alia. It is good to see you. Mariam, tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on the show. I am Mariam Jalabi. I am the representative of the Syrian Opposition Coalition to the United Nations. I have been working with the United Nations in the name of the Syrian opposition for the last 10 years. I am also a co-founder of the Syrian Women's Political Movement, which I am very keen to always highlight and talk about the need for gender equality in all the work that we do, because there will be no democracy and freedom and justice without including all people in society in the decision-making.
Dr. Zaher is a regular guest on the stream to talk about Syria. Welcome back, Doctor. Tell everybody, remind everybody who you are and what you do.
Well, thank you, Femi, for having me. And I'm a physician. My specialty is critical care medicine. I practice in Chicago. But also I head an organization called MedGlobal, where we support healthcare in disaster regions like Yemen, Gaza Strip, Bangladesh, Sudan, Sierra Leone, Colombia, and Syria, of course. Syria is my homeland. And I just returned from Syria a few days ago in a medical mission to North Syria to address the issue of COVID. And thank you for having me again.
You're welcome. Alia, nice to see you. Tell our audience who you are.
Hi, Femi. It's great to be with you. My name is Alia Malik, and I direct the International Reporting Concentration at the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. And I am also the author of a book on Syria, The Home That Was Our Country. And I write about Syria, both as a country and wherever its people have gone to. Most recently, I have a series that runs in the New York Times Magazine about the same Syrian refugees that I traveled with from Greece to Northern Europe. And I've been following their lives for the past 6 years and plan to for the next 4.
Thank you so much. And if you're watching on YouTube, you know what you can do. We have a comment section. You can jump right into the comment section and be part of today's program. Doctor, you said you were in Syria just recently. If you could give us a sense of where is the conflict right now? What did you see that would show that Syria is 10 years into a conflict?
Well, Syria is still in crisis. It's still in conflict. Unfortunately, the 6 million refugees are still refugees in the neighboring countries, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, in Iraq, and other places. There is a large number of refugees in Europe. The displaced people in Syria are still displaced. Half of the population, 11 million people, are displaced. I was in Idlib province, which is controlled by the opposition, and it has 4.2 million people. Half of them have been displaced from other regions in Syria, from Hama, from Homs, Deir ez-Zor, Dar'a, Damascus, Ghouta, and other places, Aleppo, of course. And there's no future for them. 1.2 million of them live in camps, in tented camps, 1,250 camps. I visited one of the camps, met with a child. Her name is Asma. I met with her also last year at the peak of the displacement. She was displaced with her family 7 times before she ended in a camp near Idlib city. And last year I asked her what she wants to be in the future, and she told me that she wants to be a doctor. This time she's not going to school because she has to work with her family to earn living. And this is unfortunate because what's happening in Syria is affecting a whole generation of children. The Syrian crisis started with children calling for freedom, and 55,000 of them have been killed since the beginning of the crisis. Their life expectancy was cut down by 13 years in the 10 years of conflict, and they still are the main victims of the crisis. And unfortunately, the international community does not have a solution for them to end this crisis and move towards peace and justice.
Mariam, our audience on YouTube are asking this question. What are they fighting for? This comes from Tokikush.
Who's fighting? What are the Syrians fighting for? Is that the question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think, I don't know where you're from, but when you live in any democratic country in the world, you're expected to go every number of years to go vote for a new president, a new government, a new representative for your government. We did not have that right, and we do not have that right in Syria. Many people, like myself, my family was forced to leave the country because the oppression and the lack of freedoms in the country were so strong that my dad had been imprisoned 5 times. He had to flee the country. So people came out in the streets 10 years ago asking for change to that kind of oppressive regime that we have in Syria. It's been ruled by the Assad regime, the father and now the son, and there is no freedoms of any sort. So people came out on the streets to ask for dignity and freedom and respect and democracy, and they were faced by guns, by military force, by planes, by barrel bombs, by everything possible to stop them from coming out to the street to demand their basic rights that any people in any democratic country have.
Alia, as the doctor was speaking, you were shaking your head. What was going on as you were hearing some of what he was seeing down on the ground in Syria right now?
I was just thinking about the immense amount of trauma that Syrians are facing individually and then collectively. And, I think we underestimate what, he was speaking about the children and about children are quite literally the future. And I just think, how can you build a future on, for this generation and with this generation, by this generation, when the trauma is so immense and there isn't really a possibility to remediate it by asking for justice or accountability. Even before the last 10 years, which was sort of the 5th decade of the Assad regime, in which we saw them unleash brutal violence that was visible and tangible. The regime, the first 4 decades had also been violent, granted in a kind of violence that is harder to see, but the threat of arbitrary detention and disappearance kept everybody quite in check. And I think a lot of what we saw in the last 10 years was sort of in part the result of a society that had been traumatized for decades already. And and that translated in many ways into an inability to sort of actualize the kind of future that I think people came out onto the streets for. And I'm working closely with refugees as a board member of an organization in Lebanon, but also as a journalist, and I sit with people and I hear how they're trying to rebuild their lives. And the obstacles are immense, and the inability to have any kind of justice or accountability, I think, just compounds that level of trauma and violence that people have been forced to live with. It's just devastating.
Just to follow up on what Alia has mentioned and Ms. Jalabi, Mariam. Right now we're witnessing in Myanmar what happened in Syria 10 years ago, where you have demonstrators asking for, freedom, for democracy, and the Myanmar army is meeting them with snipers who are shooting at them. And today they killed about 30 or 50 people, demonstrators. That happened in Syria for 9 months, where you have peaceful demonstration against the regime, asking for the same freedom that we enjoy in the West, in the United States, in Europe, and other places. And they were met by snipers and by the army. And eventually people carried arms to protect themselves, to protect their families and communities from mass rape, from displacement, from snipers, from people coming to the hospitals to pull out patients from the intensive care unit, from torture. You know, we're talking about a scale of torture that we have never witnessed in the recent memory. 200,000 people disappeared in Syria. 88,000 of them were tortured to death by the Assad regime. 600,000 people were killed, which is 2.7% of the population. This is largest than any other conflict. So the scale of the atrocities that happened in Syria, displacement of half of the population, 12 million people, is unheard of since the Second World War. The scale of the psychological trauma on children is unheard of. Every child in Syria is growing without a certain future, and that's adding to the trauma of displacement and violence that they have witnessed. So this is something that has to force the international community to react. You know, the fact that we're not seeing Syria in the media is very painful for us, not only because we are Syrian, but because this has never been witnessed by the world. And in the past, the world used to intervene to stop atrocities. In Syria, for some reason, we're turning the other way. And this is not helpful because it will come back to haunt us. At one point, justice will prevail. But what happened in Syria is affecting the whole world. The anti-refugee sentiment, the anti-immigrant sentiment, the rise of terrorism, the rise of hate group and populism. All of this happening in Europe and in the United States in reaction to the Syrian crisis, but for some reason we're not connecting the dot. The people are not connecting the dot, and policymakers, especially the leaders of the United States, President Biden and before him Trump and Obama, turn the other way from this crisis that are affecting us.
Let me share some questions with you from our audience, so because they really want to talk to you, and it's so rare that we get all Syrians to talk to our audience. Akash wants to know, and Mariam, may I put this one to you? I want to ask, what is the UN Security Council, UNHRC, that's the refugee organisation of the United Nations, doing to handle the situation? I've got many questions, Mariam, but if you could answer this one very briefly, I'd really appreciate that. Go ahead.
The Security Council has 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members who are elected every 2 years. So out of the 5 permanent members, they have the veto power to stop any kind of resolution that comes out of the Security Council that is for international action. There has been 15 resolutions that were put forward on Syria to create some kind of a solution on the ground, whether it was humanitarian or on accountability or on any political process. And China and Russia has vetoed this 15 times. So there is a very strong element that is supporting this, or strong amount, what element, like another dictatorship or another regime that's supporting this process that the regime has taken on of killing its own people, this war against the people, that it makes it very difficult to do anything through the Security Council.
There's something that I want to talk about, and you're all alluding to this, and this is the sense of accountability. Where is the accountability? Dr. Zuhair, you talked about the dreadful statistics of the people who have died. This is a tragedy in modern times, and we talk to Syrians about where does the accountability, where is that? Have a listen, have a look.
We cannot talk about political transition or reconciliation without holding those who are committing violations from all sides accountable, including Assad. Without that, every future dictator won't hesitate to crush any uprising brutally.
We really need to be looking at both state and non-state actors, and we need to design the accountability process so that it centers the most culpable, which would be the Assad regime. But accountability shouldn't be just on the most culpable. It should be for every party and every person that participated in war crimes.
Alia, there is a process, a legal process going on in Germany right now. Tell us more about that, and where do you feel the accountability may well be?
Well, you're referring to the trials in Koblenz in Germany, where 2 members of the Mukhabarat, one who's quite senior, the other quite junior, have been put on trial, and the verdict has come down against the junior member. But ironically, both of these men are men who defected from the regime. And in the case of the junior Mukhabarat member, he was giving his testimony to the German authorities to make his asylum case, that he needed asylum because he was in danger for having defected from the regime. And it was in those interviews that the German police and the German state realized he had actually been an active member of the Mukhabarat, and he went from a refugee asking for asylum to defendant, and now he has been sentenced to 4 years, 2 of which have been served for his participation in crimes against humanity. The more senior members' trial will take longer, and so yes, Anwar al-Bunni is a friend and the Syrian lawyer who he's one of the few people I actually speak to who remains hopeful in general. So the question is, you know, a lot of people put a lot of stake in getting a guilty verdict, and other people didn't. And people have been surprised. There are some people for whom they didn't think there would be much satisfaction in a junior member getting a guilty verdict, and have found themselves, in fact, quite, finding some kind of catharsis in it, while others who were hoping to have that catharsis didn't. It's going to be a very individual reaction on many levels. But in terms of like true accountability, the greatest perpetrators of the violence remain in power in Syria. So we're talking about accountability, but we should also talk about impunity. And to just pick up on Dr. Sahlou's point from earlier, in terms of the messaging that goes to the rest of the world when they see what happened in Syria. I watch the news from Hong Kong, from Myanmar, from Belarus, from Russia, and for those rulers who want to be able to act with impunity, there is quite a model in Syria that not only will you enjoy this kind of impunity, eventually the world will normalize your presence. And similarly, the message that's sent to the young people in Myanmar or in Belarus is that you must be willing to either pay with your life or with exile if you want to speak up, because the world is not necessarily going to stand with you if your country doesn't pose a sort of natural resource interest to the rest of the world.
Exactly. And on this same point, some people may think accountability only affects the Syrian people. And I think all of us agree that without accountability, without transitional justice, we will not move into national reconciliation, return of the refugees, reconstruction, and peace in Syria. That happened in all other crises like Syrian crisis. We need to have an accountability, but also lack of accountability, killing doctors and nurses and bombing hospitals without accountability. That means other regime will do the same, and that happened. Using chemical weapons 330 times in Syria by the Assad regime, that means other regime will use chemical weapons. And we've seen that done by North Korea, by assassinating someone with a chemical weapon, by Russia assassinating 2 of its citizens by using chemical agents. So lack of accountability will affect the whole world if we keep a blind eye on what's happening in Syria. Sure. I met with Dr. Hassan al-A'raj in one of the hospitals that I work with him. It's built inside the cave for protection of hospitals because 580 hospitals were bombed in Syria. He was killed while at duty in his hospital because he's serving his community. 940 doctors and nurses were killed in Syria, and there is no accountability.
Guest, if I may, because I'm going to squeeze in one more thought here, Maria, if I may, because we spoke to so many Syrians and they shared their thoughts with us on video, as well as you generously sharing your thoughts with us live right now. So we asked them about what were the big events that really were milestones for them over the last 10 years. And this is what they told us.
10 years of the Syrian revolution. The supporters of this Syrian revolution have got used for the pictures and for the photos that they have had from the Syrian field, the pictures of the women, the pictures of the children and vulnerables. I think everybody and every party that have a fingerprint in the Syrian destruction, I think they have to be accountable.
I don't think someone could forget about the crimes have been committed in Syria, starting from the attacks on the peaceful protests to the parabombs attacks and the chemical weapons attacks. 100,000 of victims, millions of refugees, and everybody knows who is the butcher of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, and his allies, Russia and Iran.
Guess we have just a few minutes left for the end of this show. It's extraordinary how much there is to talk about Syria and how little and how seldom we do so. Mariam, would you very swiftly finish your thought and then tell us one milestone that you want to share with us from the last decade of the Syrian conflict? Go ahead.
I wanted to actually, it was so nice to hear what the activists had been saying, is that one thing that we sometimes find in the media where they're talking about how it's a complicated crisis, people look at it, and from afar, Syrians killing Syrians. And there is this confusion about what might be happening on the ground in Syria, as if it's some natural disaster or really like a civil war where you have, because of ethnic background or religious backgrounds that people are fighting together. What we have in Syria is a dictatorship that's killing its own people. Over 90% of the atrocities that have taken place in Syria, the main reason for why people are leaving the country, the refugee crisis, all of the humanitarian crisis that is on the ground, it is handmade by the regime itself. The regime has besieged, now we don't talk about these things, but the regime at some point was besieging millions of people, refusing to have aid deliveries go to them because they wanted to have them submit to their power.
Is it possible to have a moment that for you is a searing moment for the last decade? Because I am going to move on to your co-panelists because we're at the end of the show. Do you have a moment, or is it the overall, this is a man-made crisis that you want to leave us with?
There's so many moments, Femi. There's so many moments, people coming out the street. Until today, people coming out and celebrating the 10th anniversary of the revolution. To me, when I see all of these videos, when I see children and women and young men and everybody, holding the flags of the revolution coming out, all of the feed that I'm getting on my Facebook, all of the feed I'm getting on Twitter,
I hear you,
all of the feed that I'm getting from family, it's amazing that we are still going on.
Let me share the conversation with Alia. Alia, go ahead. Pick one moment.
Well, I'm going to pick a bit of a downer moment for me, and I was inside Syria at this time, and this is this was a turning point for me. It was the murder of Hamza al-Khatib, the young boy who had gone on protest with his family. His 13-year-old was detained, tortured to death, castrated, burn marks, and that's all par for the course in Syrian detention. But I was stunned that the Syrian regime sort of put out a news program showing how, it was one of the first fake news programs I can think of, sort of communicating that, trying to pretend that all these were post-mortem injuries, that they hadn't happened in the custody of the regime. And I came to understand that this was a way for the regime to sort of hide threats in plain sight, to sort of threaten all of us with what could happen to us or to our children should we dissent. And that was a very unsophisticated example of disinformation and fake news, and yet it has very much characterized what has happened in the last 10 years, and in many ways answers your question as to why folks don't care, in part because these kind of disinformation campaigns that were maliciously and insidiously put out have managed to confuse people as to who the real threat is, what the truth is, and makes it easier to be apathetic and to throw your arms up and say, yeah, I just don't know.
We would need a whole week of programs on Syria, and that's not a bad idea. But for now, I'm going to share with you the Twitter handles, the social media platforms of our various different guests. Dr. Zuhail Salhul is here on Twitter. You can find him 24 hours 7. He might not reply to you 24 hours 7, but he's very committed. This is Alia's Twitter handle, and this is Mariam's Twitter handle. I'm going to leave you with the voices of Syrians reflecting on the last 10 years of conflict in their country. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time.
The regime has committed tens of thousands of crimes under the eyes of the whole world without doing anything from anyone. In my opinion, the whole world forgot the Syrian crisis because they are focusing on how to destroy the Syrian people and how to steal the Syrian oil and the other esoteric wealths.
I think people are feeling helpless. They don't know which is the best way to help the Syrian people. You think the conflict is so complex, so you don't know how to engage, how to help the Syrian people. The conflict is not complex. It's a regime killing civilians who are protesting, asking for freedom.
War crimes against civilians are ongoing. Tens of thousands of detainees are still in Assad's prisons. Millions of Syrians are displaced. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the situation.